All right, ladies and gentlemen, so today we're going to do a short lesson on discriminant. So what I want you to understand is the discriminant is part of the quadratic formula, okay, the quadratic equation. So off to the side, I'm just going to write down the quadratic equation, what we know, x equals opposite b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now the reason I'm doing that is because this word discriminant is actually talking about this stuff right there underneath the square root. It does not include the square root. It is truly just that stuff underneath that square root. So that is called the discriminant. And what we're going to look at is that discriminant tells us what type of solutions and how many that we will have. So if we are looking at this D, when they say D in these notes, that means discriminant. So what they're saying is if the discriminant is greater than 0, so what I want you to see is this symbol means greater than 0. If D is greater than 0, that means a positive number. If your discriminant is a positive number, and in particular, it's a perfect square. So as an example, potentially you had your discriminant might equal 4, or your discriminant might equal 16. And you're looking at a perfect square. You are looking at having 2 roots. And what they're going to be is the type of roots that we're going to focus on is they're going to be whole numbers. It's going to be a nice answer. They're going to be, if you graphed them, you would definitely see the intercepts would be right there on the axis with nice numbers to look at. But what I really want you to focus on is they would be 2 real solutions. Okay, so as an example, you might see something like yesterday. Yesterday we had the x squared plus 6x plus 5 equation equaled 0. And when we did the quadratic equation, and if you recall, our answers were -1 and -5. Those were our roots, our zeros, our solutions, our x-intercepts. So if we were to do the the discriminant, I would have 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 5. So 36 minus 20. And I have my discriminant is a perfect square. So if we go back to the quadratic formula, what I mean by is you're going to have nice answers is if we did the full quadratic formula, we had -6 plus or minus square root 16 all over 2, which gave us -6 plus or minus 4 over 2. And those are answers that we can very quickly do in our head. They're nice numbers. They're whole numbers. They're integers, actually. -6 plus 4 over 2 gave us -1, and -6 minus 4 over 2 gave us -5. Okay, so that's what I mean. They're 2 real solutions. We had a parabola that opened up, and my roots were nice integers. If it's not a perfect square, but it's still positive, so potentially you have something like square root of 7. So your discriminant is actually the 7 part, but if you were doing the full quadratic equation, you would have the square root. So I'm actually going to erase that square root because I don't want you to ever think that the discriminant includes the square root. It doesn't. So if your discriminant is still positive and it's not a perfect square, you still do have 2 roots. They are still real. They're not imaginary. They do touch the x-axis in 2 spots, but what just happens is we just kind of leave them in square root form. They're not nice integers that we can plot. They'd be decimal answers. Now the third scenario is if your discriminant is equal to 0. That means if we were to graph things, when we graph it, that would mean that my vertex is on the axis. So that means there'd only be one real solution. And that's if your discriminant was equal to 0. If your discriminant is less than 0 means negative. Okay, so we're looking at having a discriminant that is negative. Less than 0 means negative. Negative, go back to something that we have done before. We learned it this week. If I asked you to do the square root of -10, your discriminant, remember, is that stuff underneath the square root. So that's what I'm saying. If your discriminant is negative, we just learned that we would have I in our answer in that scenario. I also showed you this week that what would happen is we have a parabola. It's just never going to cross the x-axis. So we would have two roots, but they would be considered imaginary. So we're just going to look at this discriminant, and based on just the discriminant, we're going to know how many roots and what type. So looking at this first example, I have it set equal to 0, so therefore I can pick out my A, I can pick out my B, and I can pick out my C. I can do the discriminant, so that is just the B squared minus 4AC. That would be 12 squared minus 4 times 2 times -13. And if I open my calculator just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I have 12 squared. Notice I put it in parentheses, whether it's positive or negative, minus 4 times 2 times -13. Use those parentheses, guys. This comes out as positive 248. So I see that I have a positive discriminant, which means I'm going to have two real solutions. If I do the next example, I have it set equal to 0. So I pick out my A, -1. I pick out my B, 16. I pick out my C, -64. I do my discriminant, B squared minus 4 times A times C. Go to my calculator. I have 16 squared minus 4 times -1 times -6, and I get out 232. It is positive. So again, because my discriminant is positive, I will have two real solutions. This example, we have to make sure that we are equal to 0 first. So I move that 10x over, and I like to have things in their descending order. So power of 2, power of 1, power of 0. So my trinomial is -4x squared minus 10x plus 84 is equal to 0. I pick out my A, I pick out my B, and I pick out my C. Do the discriminant. Go to my calculator. Again, please make sure you are sticking stuff inside parentheses so you don't accidentally make a mistake. Use those parentheses. That's what it's for. I get out 1,444, which again is positive. It is going to give me two real solutions. And last example. Here I have this 3x squared, but look, there is 0 x's, and 24 is considered to be my constant. Make sure, just like yesterday, no data is data. That helps me pick out my A. That helps me pick out my B. That helps me pick out my appropriate C. B is always attached to that X. So doing this discriminant, I have B squared minus 4 times A times C. 0 squared is 0. So negative 4 times 3 times 24 gives me negative 288. My discriminant is negative, so I will still have two solutions, but this time they're going to be imaginary. There would be an I in my answer if I actually took the square root. So ladies and gentlemen, today you're going to focus on discriminant as well as working on a little bit more review. So at this point, this YouTube video is available on Schoology. You can rewatch parts of it if I walk through things too fast or if you just want to see another part. At this point, for the rest of class, you are to work on the class kick that the substitute will tell you about. It is already assigned, so make sure you guys are working, and remember there are no phones, none, 0, no phones out. Okay, get your work done. Bye guys, I'll see you Monday.